I think Knight vs. Giant has been very overlooked. It's not going to be the next Hades or the next Isaac, but this game can be a solid, fast-paced action roguelite if you're in the market for that kind of game. So let's get into it. Knight vs. Giant, the Broken Excalibur, is an action roguelite where you play as King Arthur on a quest to restore Camelot. As part of this quest, you have to kill giants in the surrounding areas after a horrible disaster has killed all of your knights and displace Camelot into an alternative mythical realm. You have a basic attack chain based on your weapon, a secondary ability or a spell that has a short cooldown, and 2 active ability slots. You also have a dodge that you'll use liberally as you play. In each run, you clear rooms that have waves of enemies spawn and have a reward at the end. Each level ends with a final boss fight that allows you to move on to the next area. The map itself is also Isaac-esque, meaning that you can retrace your steps between encounters to go to old rooms, get health, revisit merchants, things like that. Build crafting wise, your weapon and your spell are based on which knight you pick before a run starts. These also change your base stats, like your health and your movement speed. These weapons have different attack chains, like a poking lance, one ranged weapon, and various swinging swords. Spells can be picked from the same knight as your weapon or a different knight. These are skills on a short cooldown, usually 6 to 10 seconds, that allow for some form of range damage. Each knight usually also has some associated condition effect or other focus that changes how you build craft and things like that. Lancelot, for example, has a lightning effect, while Bedivere has burning. Along the way, you can upgrade your builds with 3 main mechanics. You can find gems that give small stat increases like increased movement speed or higher crit chance. You can also find statues. They give specific upgrades based on your weapon and the spell that you have equipped. Lancelot's spell, for example, makes him strike nearby enemies with lightning. This spell can be upgraded to stun all enemies when it hits them, or to leave behind a pool of lightning that keeps attacking enemies, keeps hitting them. Finally, you can also find the Round Table, which gives a broader pool of buffs and abilities from all possible knights. This can allow for some fun crossover synergies between knight abilities, like getting burning on a run where you aren't using the weapons or spell of the burning knight. This can also allow you to get those 2 active abilities that I talked about that finish up and flesh out your build. For the most part, these active abilities are various forms of damaging abilities, like poisoning or stunning all enemies around you. They can also have more unique effects, like deflecting all projectiles for a couple of seconds. As opposed to being on a timer, these active abilities fill up by you dealing damage and killing enemies. There's also an NPC you can find that allows for some risk-reward buff debuff choices along your run. A lot of these buffs are very powerful. It can make you feel almost overpowered, but at the same time, a lot of these debuffs are so strong that I almost never took them. It's still a nice choice. I'm glad that it's there, but it's not something you'll engage with or not something I engage with personally every single run. There's also a merchant you can find that sells build crafting elements in exchange for purple orbs with in-run currency. It also sells crystals, a cross-run currency, and I'll talk about that later on. Altogether, these different mechanics create a satisfying build crafting system. It feels great to have a build come together, be able to smash through waves of enemies as they spawn in the rooms. Stacking up combos can be fun, like the build I had where my character would stun enemies, drop a large fire AoE, and then throw a ranged fireball every time I finished an attack chain. Some of these abilities can also meaningfully change your gameplay, like an active ability that made me invulnerable, allowing me to do a lot more DPS during mechanics that I'd usually have to avoid. That being said, Knight vs. Giant is also a game that has fairly on-the-rails build crafting. It's not a game at all where you're going to break the game by making unique builds the developer hasn't thought of. And that's because a lot of your build comes from more straightforward stat boosting upgrades and things like that. In my opinion, the most fun part of the builds came from the Round Table upgrades that allowed for mixing build elements of different knights on the same run. But these tables are much less common than the gems and the statues. In terms of the combat itself, at first, it feels like familiar action roguelike combat. I think the game is probably most similar to Ember Knights in terms of the overall feel. The attack chains are varied based on your weapon, but they're all relatively simple. There's also only one attack type. There's not light versus heavy attack. There's no special dash attacks or anything like that. It's a fairly limited moveset. Knight vs. Giant can get very hectic very fast in each area. I wouldn't quite consider this game to be a bullet hell game, but it can give a similar vibe at times. You have rooms that have 20 enemies spawn at once, with them all chasing after you, throwing projectiles, and doing various special attacks. On top of that sheer number of enemies, the enemies themselves have pretty quick attacks. Enemies attack very often, and more importantly, they have a very short time window between when they start their attack animations and when the attacks finish and can hurt you. When you see an enemy start to attack, you see that animation, you have to spam dodge immediately or you will get hit. Trying to sneak in an extra attack here and there will almost always result in you getting smacked. The combination of a large number of enemies with those quick attack animations is a bit of a double-edged sword, or Broken Excalibur if you will. On the one hand, it creates very fast-paced, almost frantic gameplay. You can't sit in one spot and spam attack. You have to constantly be moving, dodging, and reading enemy attacks to know when it's safe to get those extra hits in. This also makes spells and active abilities more powerful because those can usually be activated and deal damage while you're still moving. This gameplay also makes for a more rewarding payoff when you have that great build and skills that allow you to safely and quickly clear those large number of enemies and just power through them. You can also stagger enemies if you deal enough damage to them, which can allow you to prevent more attacks as well if you time everything correctly. With certain upgrades, you can also have some of your attacks and some of your abilities stun enemies. And it can be fun to balance that raw DPS versus picking up abilities and attacks that allow you to stun enemies and get more attacks in. As you play this game more and as you get better, you learn how to weave in your attacks and spells in between all those frantic dodging that you do, and it creates a very satisfying gameplay loop. On the other hand though, this fast-paced combat created some frustration points when I was first learning. You basically have to proactively predict when enemies will attack, as opposed to reacting to their attack animations when you see them. This fact, combined with the sheer number of enemies, means that you spend a high percentage of your time playing the game just dodging around and running in circles, and a very low percentage of time, relatively speaking, actually attacking enemies, unless your build has great DPS and allows you to clear them out quickly. It can feel like you can't pause to attack at all sometimes, because there's so many incoming AoEs and projectiles at once, and it can feel possible to avoid all that incoming damage. The game does do a great job of giving you a lot of healing opportunities, so taking an attack here and there is not the end of the world, but it can still be frustrating. This mix of so many enemies and fast attacks also created some visual clarity problems, especially on bosses. The bosses in this game are large because they're giants, knight versus giant. But it also means your character gets very small, making it easy to lose your character in the mess of the boss, the attacks, the AoEs, the various minions, things like that. It can also feel hard or impossible to not take extra hits that you don't see coming because enemies are off screen or because the projectiles or circles are hidden by the bosses and other enemies. I think it's worth reiterating after that every single individual attack is telegraphed, even if only briefly. And the game also does a good job of trying to make things visually clear, like having a visual ring around your character if the foreground is cluttered and would block them. But having so many attacks and so many enemies at once will always create some clutter. A lot of these potential gameplay frustrations for me were solved as I got better. For example, learning to prioritize which enemies to attack, those enemies that are harder to avoid, made me not take as much damage from those attacks because I had killed the enemies first. Some of those problems never fully went away though. A final problem worth noting is that the bosses have some weird hitboxes at times. The bosses themselves are massive compared to you, but you only actually hit a small portion of them, usually their feet. On the other hand though, they can smack you with basically every portion of them. So it's kind of a weird mismatch at times. Once you learn where to attack, it gets better. But I did also have times where I got smacked by attacks that it felt like should have missed me. And there are times when I thought I was attacking the boss because I was swinging away at them, but I was just swooshing the air. As you can see, I kind of go back and forth a little bit on specific combat elements. Overall though, I enjoyed this combat system, and I like how fast-paced it feels. It forces a lot of motion, and it forces well-timed dodges that can feel satisfying. It makes you think about when you can actually get attacks in, and it punishes you for trying to greed extra attacks and not play safely and smartly. It also feels amazing when you're able to clear out waves of enemies that seemed impossible when you first encounter them. But the mix of the sheer number of enemies combined with their very quick attacks will frustrate some people and will turn some people away. Developers have also made a lot of updates to improve some of these issues since launch, such as around hitboxes and improving clarity. They've also done some updates to expand the build crafting a lot since launch. I do think there are still some improvements that could be done, like on hitboxes for the bosses, just to make the game feel a little bit better to play. Briefly talking about the Steam Deck for this game, I played this game mostly on my Steam Deck actually. This game runs really well on Steam Deck, and the game also has good native controller support, which is great because these types of games, these action roguelites, are generally something I play with controller anyways. So definitely a green check mark for me in regards to the Steam Deck. Now let's talk about variety and randomness in Night vs. Giant. As I mentioned earlier, the builds in this game are good, but they're pretty on the rails. For the most part, when you pick a weapon and spell at the start, you'll be determining the bulk of your run-to-run variety. One of the most impactful things run-to-run are whether you get certain powerful upgrades, certain statue buffs for your weapon, and for your spell. Certain combos for your shockwave spell, for example, would make it deal more shockwaves, make those shockwaves deal AoE damage, or make those shockwaves leave a fire trail behind them. And these upgrades can all feel very impactful. You can always get some of these changes, some of these combos, but it's pretty rare for you to get all of them. While all of the spells themselves are ranged, there's only one ranged base weapon. I think it's ultimately fine because you can always have range damage with the spell, but that also makes this game primarily melee focused. I think some weapons also just control better than others and feel better to play. You always have to be looking or moving in the same direction you attack. It's a single joystick control scheme, which for the most part is absolutely fine. But it makes a couple weapons feel a little finicky, like the ranged weapon or the sword weapon that has a very small attack range. Having to look in the direction that you aim means that there's some forced movement. And the attack animations and attack chains also have some forced movement built in for a couple of the weapons. Sometimes this makes it so that you hop over enemies, you have to double back, turn around in order to keep attacking them. This is less of a problem with some of the weapons that have more sweeping, swooshing attack chains. The third main build variety element comes in the form of the round table, which gives you your two active abilities, as well as special cross-knight synergies and combos. For example, it can allow for new condition effects on other builds. It can make certain builds, like crypt builds, more viable, all depending on what upgrades you find at the round table. Because of that, I would say the round table, through those active abilities and those unique abilities, is the area where RNG and randomness run-to-run is most impactful for your build. One point that Night vs. Giant does really well is in regards to enemy variety. Each of the 3 biomes have around 10 different enemy types you'll encounter along the way, and they have a good variety of different attack patterns and different movesets. Some will melee, some will jump at you, some will shoot various projectiles, some will launch AoE attacks at you, things like that. Additionally, all these enemy types have elite forms that have more health and additional, more complicated attack patterns for you to learn. I had a really great time learning how to fight all these different enemies, even when they all combo together. Along with that, each area, each biome, has both a mini-boss and the final giant boss. While the final giant boss is always the same, the mini-boss for each area has some good variety, with the first area, for example, having 3 different mini-boss variants. Some variety in the giants themselves would have also been nice, but I found them interesting enough run to run. The final element of randomness and variety in Night vs. Giant comes in the form of the map layout. Similar to Isaac or Undermine, each area in Night vs. Giant has a grid-like overmap. You clear areas one at a time before going to the next. Each level has basically the same number of areas, the same 2 NPCs, and 1 healing shrine. I haven't specifically counted run to run if the upgrades are exactly the same, but I'm pretty sure that each level has the same number of statues, 1 round table, and the same number of gem rooms run to run as well. As such, this map layout changes when you encounter certain rooms, when you get certain rewards, but there's very little RNG in regards to the distribution of reward types. Obviously, which rewards are offered run to run will vary, what the statue gives you will vary, but you'll always get roughly the same number of each type of upgrade. The game also gives you a clear indication before you enter a boss room, so you'll never stumble into a boss room accidentally. You can always clear all the other rooms first if you want to flesh out your build a little more before fighting the boss. As a whole, the only heavy source of RNG in this game comes in the form of which specific rewards you get for your build at the round table and the statue. Different mini-bosses that you fight also add another source of good run-to-run variety, and they're all roughly the same difficulty. It's enough RNG to give some different flavor run-to-run, but it's just not an RNG-heavy game. The largest source of run-to-run variety comes in the form of your choice at the start of what weapon and what spell you want to play. Night vs. Giant has a hardy amount of progression, with a lot of that progression being vertical progression, or upgrades that make you more powerful run-to-run. Between runs, you're tasked with rebuilding the destroyed town of Camelot. In order to do that, you first find NPCs along your run, and then you must rebuild and upgrade their respective buildings to access whatever that NPC offers. These can range from upgrade shops to small side quests to more flavor NPCs. The first main unlock system comes in the form of unlocking more knight statues, and these, in turn, unlock more weapon types and more spell variety. There's nothing special you have to do for this, and you just naturally come across new knights every couple runs, provided that you have the sculptor building built. All buildings in this game are built with 2 cross-run currencies or resources, gold and crystals. Gold is the main progression currency, and you gain gold primarily by killing enemies and bosses or completing side quests. You can also destroy objects along your run, like different boxes, crates, things like that, but that's mostly a waste of time. Crystals are the second currency that's a lot more rare. They primarily come from killing the final giant boss of each area of each biome. And you can also buy 1 crystal during each area at the NPC merchant. I really hated this mechanic. You have to buy the crystals with purple orbs, which are a within-run currency that can also be used to buy upgrades and make your build more powerful. I always hate when you have to choose between cross-run progression, speeding that up, or within-run power, making your build more fun. Because regardless of what choice I make, it always feels unsatisfying. Either I'm sacrificing progression, or I'm sacrificing within-run fun. I originally ignored the ability to buy crystals, but as I realized how much vertical progression there is, and also how powerful it is, I began to prioritize always buying the crystals when possible. In terms of the upgrades themselves, the progression mostly comes in the form of a couple NPCs. The blacksmith, who upgrades individual weapons and spells for gold, Sir Galahad, the old knight that adds cross-knight upgrades like increased power in exchange for crystals, and the gem seller and the tarot card merchant that have slightly different mechanics that can shift your build a little bit run to run. I didn't do the exact math on this, but I expect that a full set of upgrades makes you 3 to 5 times as powerful as compared to no upgrades, and that's a pretty large power boost. That being said, the cost of each upgrade increases linearly as you buy more of them. So it's pretty easy to get a couple upgrades in each area for each weapon, but you'll quickly slow down. And if you wanted to get every single upgrade, it would take quite a bit of time. It doesn't feel like something you have to grind out, but there is a grind there if you're looking for that. I think Night vs. Giant does this progression system as a whole very well. It feels satisfying to discover NPCs and slowly rebuild Camelot. The NPCs provide a nice mix of different unlocks and a nice pacing for unlocking those new NPCs as well. If you're looking for a roguelite with a healthy amount of vertical progression, I think Night vs. Giant does a good mix of different progression systems that are both Knight specific, as well as some more general power-ups and cross-run buffs. My main complaint with the system comes in the form of buying crystals, costing within-run currency, and obviously, if you hate strong vertical progression, you won't like this game at all because you do get a lot more powerful as you get these upgrades. It is worth noting, a lot of this progression had different balance and different pacing when the game first released. For example, each Knight upgrade gave about 1% of the power increase that it does now, and it would take hours to unlock each Knight, as opposed to a couple runs that it takes now. The developer changed these things in response to feedback at the game's launch, and a couple of the things seemed like bugs in the first place. If you stopped playing this game at the initial launch because the pacing fell off, the progression felt poorly tuned, you should know that those things have been tweaked and have been improved. In terms of difficulty settings, Night vs. Giant has a customizable challenge-based difficulty. You can add modifiers like increase enemy health, decrease King Arthur health, things like that. When you stack enough modifiers to pass certain thresholds, the game gives you increased reward in the form of increased cross-run progression currency. This difficulty system feels fine, and I think any game with strong vertical progression is basically required to have some difficulty level to go along with it. That being said, it took 4 or 5 wins until I actually unlocked the system, so it felt a little slower to unlock than I would like. The game also has a mechanic that wants you to win 10 runs to progress and unlock something else, but that challenge is mostly for progressing the story. So on that note, let's talk about the narrative and story in Night vs. Giant. Night vs. Giant actually has a surprisingly good story, both in terms of the quantity of story elements and the quality of the story itself. The game starts with an opening cutscene explaining how Merlin sent the knights on a quest to retrieve the Holy Grail, a classic in any story of Camelot. And that quest resulted in the destruction of Camelot and launched it into a different realm. This explosion also killed all the knights and King Arthur in the process. But Merlin brought King Arthur back to life to help restore Camelot. The story gets interesting because Merlin clearly knows a lot more than he is telling the king, than he's telling the player. He knows, for example, how the Holy Grail causes catastrophe, and he knows a couple too many details about this new realm that you find yourself in. As you unlock more knight statues, you also unlock the ability to talk to ghosts of those knights, who recount the events of finding the Holy Grail and what led to the explosion, which don't always line up with what Merlin's telling you. Because of that, the story is a constant tension between what Merlin's knowledge and motivations are while you explore the realm more, encounter creatures, and it has interesting implications for the fake religion of these Knights of Camelot as well. Most of the story is told through text boxes, but there's actually a good number of voice-acted lines as well, especially for the critical story scenes. Sometimes it's a little weird though, because you'll have 1 or 2 lines out of 10 lines of dialogue in a row that are voice-acted. This gives the game a bit of a weird vibe, because it makes it feel like it was supposed to be fully voice-acted. But maybe they scaled back that voice acting because the game didn't do as well as they thought it would. The dialogue definitely felt cheesy at times, but I liked it as a whole. I enjoyed all the different characters, and I enjoyed the dynamics between them. It also felt fun to slowly find more NPCs, to talk with them, and learn more about the world. So this game isn't another Hades storytelling-wise, but it is actually one of the better roguelites out there in regard to the story, in regards to the narrative. So what's my verdict on Knight vs. Giant? I think Knight vs. Giant is a good action roguelite as a whole. It checks all the boxes, broadly speaking, of things I would want in an action roguelite. It has generally fun and fast-paced combat, it has some decent variety, it has some nice progression, and it even has some nice world building to top it all off. I have 3 main criticisms of this game, or 3 areas that make it so that you might not want to buy this game. First, while the fast-paced combat is fun, it also has some quirks and annoyances along with it. The number of enemies combined with how fast they attack can be frustrating. There can be visual clutter, it can be easy to take damage, it can be hard to time your dodges, things like that. And that will definitely frustrate and turn off some people from playing this game. Second, the build crafting is very on the rails. There are some very fun builds. I had a lot of fun making those builds. It's just not a game where you're going to discover some novel, creative build crafting that breaks the game, creates some super OP build. That's just not how it's structured. And that hurts the replayability of Knight vs. Giant to those players that want that. Finally, the game is missing some X factor to make it really special, to make it really stand out. It does a lot of things well, but it doesn't do any one particular thing so well that it makes me want to preach about the game for that reason. And because of that, I would recommend Knight vs. Giant if you're looking for a new action roguelite. I would recommend it if you want a game that has fast-paced combat specifically, if you like good size vertical progression systems, or if you want a roguelite with a little more story. But it's not a game that I feel like you have to immediately run out and buy and start playing right now. Shout out to all of our channel members for helping support the channel. Please like this video to help me out in the algorithm, and thanks for watching.